Thanks for joining us today for this consultation that we have underway on operationalizing Article 6 and ensuring responsible claims. My name is Sarah Lugers. I'm the Director of Communications here at Gold Standard, and I'd like to start with a little bit of context on why we're here today and why we've initiated this consultation. So stepping forward to the next slide. If we can step forward to the next slide, you'll see that we're in an inflection point, a time of really exciting growth in the carbon markets and a lot of change as well. There's a number of dynamics at play. We're seeing carbon markets increasingly embraced as a climate solution, as seen by skyrocketing corporate demand and interest from the financial sector, as well as we see in the task force for scaling the voluntary carbon market. And we've also accelerated from some of the requirements coming out of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, for example, as well as the WWF Blueprint for Corporate Action on Climate and Nature. We're seeing domestic schemes continue to emerge, often leveraging voluntary carbon standards like Gold Standard. And the same is true in compliance markets for instruments like CORSIA. And then, of course, the negotiations for Article 6 are underway, leading up to next month, where we hope to have some conclusion on the rulebook for Article 6. Yet even without that clarity, we already have signals from some governments about how they intend to use cooperative approaches to meet their NDCs. For example, Gold Standard is working with the Swedish Energy Agency to support their use of ITMOs under Article 6.2, which we see as a potential model for others to follow suit in the coming years to deliver climate finance for impact. So it's clear that the lines are blurring among market mechanisms just at the same time as demand is rising. So the market's garnering a lot more of attention and sometimes skepticism. And so it's really the right time. The major opportunity that's before us is to, as we see it, build a global carbon market based on high integrity principles that lead to maximum fungibility and flexibility, and therefore more market opportunity and access for project developers and other market participants. So that's what we'll explore in some detail today. I'll step you through the agenda very quickly and then turn it over to the experts to lead the conversation. So we step forward one slide. Well, you'll already have had an intro from me. We're fortunate to be joined by some esteemed guests. We have Felipe de Leon from the Costa Rican government, as well as Florian Eckholt from Atmosphere, who will deliver some introductory remarks. And then from there, we will deep dive into the content of the consultation itself, talk about the requirements that we've proposed, as well as new claims guidance, and some new opportunities for early movers as this gets underway. And then finally, we'll end with some Q&A. We'll ask you to participate and ask your questions to Gold Standard. You can submit these along the way through the chat, but we can also take them as we move into the Q&A session. So with that, I would like to invite I'm jumping ahead to the content. I'd like to invite Felipe de Leon to deliver some opening remarks and set the scene here for us today.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, wherever you may be. I'd like to start by thanking, of course, the Gold Standard and Hugh particularly for the invitation to speak here briefly. As was mentioned, my name is Felipe de Leon de Negri, and I'm an advisor for the Ministry of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica, where, among other things, I work as the Article 6 negotiator and the Article 6 coordinator for ILAC. So a part of what I do is negotiating our positions at the UNFCCC as they relate to international carbon markets. And from that perspective, I guess, it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to participate in a small way in this consultation process, because I think it's an incredibly important consultation process, because we're speaking to two extremely relevant elements of the overall robustness of international carbon markets in general, right? The operationalization of Article 6 and the rules for accounting, basically, and ensuring that whatever claims are made are responsible claims and really meet the reality of how things are happening, right? And perhaps I'll start very briefly by going back to the importance of high ambition carbon markets, of both compliance and voluntary. As I said before, we've seen recently a swell of activity, a surge of activity in carbon markets, and a surge of interest in carbon markets, very much related to net carbon neutrality and to 2050 net zero goals in both countries and the private sector. And this, of course, is great news. It's welcome news. It speaks to more engagement and to more climate action. But it is also news that must be taken with care, because the way international carbon markets function, and because of the fact that emission reductions are basically, we're trading things that are a certificate for a transparent inodorous gas that was not emitted or taken out of the atmosphere, right? And so accounting is not easy to do. It's not like inventories, like physical inventories for stock, where you can actually go and count things and touch them and make sure that they are only in one place and not in another. And where inventory mistakes in systems can easily be corrected because you can physically go count the things and actually figure out what they are and where they are. In our case, we have to rely on very sophisticated, very technically complex measures to ensure that accounting is correct, because as many famous scientists have pointed out in the past, physics doesn't negotiate, right? If we have an accounting glitch, or if somebody is being clever and somehow being able to subvert the truth of the accounting, that might show up in our systems, but the physics that will be taking place in the atmosphere and the impacts that will bring on our lives, on our livelihoods, those won't be convinced, those won't be tricked by clever accounting. So we have to have real, robust, integral accounting. We have a single planet, we have a single atmosphere, and we have to have a single accounting system that covers and that accurately reflects what is happening in the world, so that we can use this extremely powerful, this hugely, this tool with huge potential that we have in carbon markets in a productive manner, in a manner that actually delivers on what we are intending to do, and not just on moving around resources from one place to another. As you may be aware, the government of Costa Rica and the Gold Standard have recently announced a collaboration along these lines. It is very much a pleasure and a privilege to be able to work with the Gold Standard from the very beginning, to start to figure out how we bring these new rules and these new rules that we hope we will finalize and agree on in Glasgow into the voluntary space, into the voluntary market space, and make sure that we have, again, consistency, that we have a high integrity participation. And that's part of a broader suite of things that Costa Rica has been doing to ensure that that happens. If any of you are familiar with our decarbonization plans and our climate action plans, we don't really foresee participating in markets in any major way. We don't foresee using international carbon markets as a major tool in our decarbonization efforts. And so some might wonder why a country that is quite small, that has gone quite far in its efforts to decarbonize already, and that doesn't plan to use international carbon markets, participates so much in these things. And it's basically because we recognize that the potential of international carbon markets is too large to be left unbridled, and that if properly applied, it can be transformational in our climate action. But if improperly applied, it can also become a almost insurmountable barrier to achieving our goals. And so to that effect, we've been working on import criteria to make sure that the things that come into Costa Rica for use in our carbon neutrality program, for example, meet certain quality criteria and meet certain other criteria related to our positions and our interests in the region. We have export criteria to make sure that any units that are recognized and approved basically for corresponding adjustment as part of from Costa Rica meet certain criteria, both in terms of environmental integrity, ensuring that they live up to the San Jose principles, which Costa Rica promotes, of course, and that they will not undermine our ability to deliver our NDC. And we've been working for 5 or 6 years on a metric system, a climate change metric system that allows us to do very robust MRV, and that is directly linked to a registry, a climate credit registry, basically, that allows us to have a single source of truth, if you will, on where all of our potential liabilities in this respect are. And these are all being developed in open source. They're all being made public, I think, under much of the same ideals that motivates part of this consultation, which is in making sure that we share the best practices as widely and as quickly as possible, and that we share our failures as well, so that the entire community that works in these fields and around international carbon markets can profit and can not just grow as quickly as possible, but grow as robustly, grow as environmentally integral as possible, because this is, again, the whole point of the exercise, right? We have the peculiar privilege of working in a field where this market exists only for a specific purpose. International carbon markets have absolutely no point if they do not deliver real emission reductions, if they do not move us closer to our goals with regard to the climate crisis. And so we have to ensure that they actually do that, and as well as growing as quickly and as thriving as possible. I'll close with a quote from my minister, Andrea Mesa, on specifically this issue, as part of the, which was issued as part of the materials related to the launch of this collaboration, which basically says that, and I quote, "We cannot afford the luxury of wasting time or resources on schemes that fail to live up to the moment. Carbon markets, whether under the UNFCCC or otherwise, must be implemented focused on environmental integrity, on the protection of human rights, particularly of indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant communities, and other local stakeholders, on ensuring a robust accounting on the basis of corresponding adjustments, and on ensuring a just transition to an adapted, resilient, and decarbonized world." As you can hear there, our vision for climate action is not just a vision that reduces emission. It absolutely must reduce emissions, but it must also provide a better life, a better quality of life, especially for the most vulnerable people, communities, and ecosystems. And it is in that broader context that we collaborate, that we are happy to collaborate with the Gold Standard and with all of our partners, and that we look forward to continuing to work with all of you. Thank you very much, and looking forward to this session.
Thank you so much, Felipe. I can say from our side, it's also an honor to work with a leading government like Costa Rica on this initiative. I'd like to now invite Florian Eichholt from Atmosphere to share some words from the project developer perspective. Florian.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me well? Yeah.
Very well.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to this important launch event to say some words, maybe from a project developer and market perspective. I would underline what you just said, Sarah. It's an honor to speak here next to Costa Rica, a country that hosted the signature of the San Jose Principles that stand for environmental integrity and proper design of global carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. My role at Atmosphere is to align voluntary carbon market projects with the new environment of the Paris Agreement. And I will come back to some of the practical matters here later. As you might know, Atmosphere is a project developer with a focus on bottom of the pyramid renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. The voluntary carbon market is the main instrument Atmosphere uses to provide the funds to finance sustainable energy transition in the global south. All its larger projects are registered under CDM plus Gold Standard. Atmosphere is observing closely the multilateral negotiations and rules that have direct or indirect implications on the voluntary carbon market. There is now the opportunity to place the voluntary carbon market on a solid fundament aligned with the Paris Agreement. I appreciate the work by Gold Standard and all the efforts providing guidance at this time of regulatory uncertainty. The opportunity I would describe in twofold. Voluntary carbon markets with corresponding adjustments can lead to ambition raising, to more emission reductions. And the proper design of voluntary carbon markets can build trust and lead to further voluntary investments from private sector into climate protection. From my experience, leading companies getting engaged in high quality carbon projects want to accelerate decarbonization processes and move quicker than governments through voluntary action. There is still a lot of work that has to be done to establish some new rules, some new processes that are needed, but key elements do not have to wait, and pragmatic approaches are necessary while keeping integrity. I'm very happy to announce that through bilateral talks, Atmosphere achieved with Rwanda and Nepal bilateral agreements to avoid double counting under the Paris Agreement for 2 large POAs that can then supply the market with high quality carbon units after 2020. I'm looking really forward to this event. Thank you again for inviting me. And I wish especially Felipe and other negotiators who might be in this call a successful COP in Glasgow. Thank you very much.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much, Florian, and congratulations to Atmosphere for being some of the first to secure these LOAAs. It's really encouraging to know that this is possible while we acknowledge that there's much more capacity building and work to be done. You're blazing the trail there, so that's great. I'd like to now turn to Hugh Salloway, Head of Environmental Markets at Gold Standard, to discuss the consultation proposals in more detail. Hugh, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. And thanks as well to Felipe and to Florian for setting the tone here for this event and providing some perspectives from outside Gold Standard. I think it's really valuable to hear that ahead of Article 6 negotiations and to hear about what's happening on the ground as well in the case of Atmosphere. So I think that's really important. As Sarah just mentioned, I will now take some time to explain in a bit more detail the 2 documents that we published last week for public consultation. These are shown on the screen now, which hopefully everyone can see. Firstly, we published last week a revised set of double counting requirements and procedures in Gold Standard's rules. And the revision that we've made here is to include and introduce a process and requirements by which Gold Standard can manage credits authorized for use under Article 6, so those which will have corresponding adjustments. And the second thing that we published is a revised set of claims guidelines. And these updated claims guidelines provide updated guidance on claims that should be made with respect to the use of carbon credits. And for those who've been engaged with Gold Standard for a while and following some of the consultations and work that we've done over the past few years, you'll know that we spent a lot of time thinking about the future of the voluntary market, the future of compliance markets, and how Gold Standard can really continue our mission of supporting high integrity climate action under Paris. And these 2 things are really important parts of our work to do that, which is why we wanted to bring together this webinar to really explain what we're trying to do through these 2 documents. The consultation opened last Tuesday and will close on the 19th of November, which leaves a little bit of time after the end of COP26 before it will close. And I'll share a bit more on the timeline in a second. Next slide, please. I'm going to start just by providing a little bit more context and explanation for the new process that we are planning to introduce to manage units which have been authorized under Article 6. And that language may not be familiar to some of you on the call, but what I think will be more familiar is the concept of a corresponding adjustment. And what we mean in practice by this is the process by which we will manage units that the host country has agreed to make a corresponding adjustment for. And by that, we mean units which emission reductions represented as carbon credits that they won't count towards their own NDC, and which a buyer, when they purchase and retire those credits, will therefore have a unique claim to. And before I kind of go on and explain this, I just want to sort of say this is not something that will be required of all projects to use this process, but it will be needed to open up some eligibility for credits certified and issued by Gold Standard, which I'll explain in a second. The reason why we're doing this is that we expect soon to be managing credits which have received host country authorizations under Article 6. And Florian has just provided an example of that from the Atmosphere perspective, where Atmosphere has agreement now from 2 countries for authorizations under Article 6. So there are real world applications of this coming. And we in Gold Standard want to make sure that we are ready and have robust procedures in place by which we can manage these and we can facilitate action under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. There are 3 uses of this process that we expect for Gold Standard. So as Sarah mentioned earlier, we have a partnership with the Swedish government under which we will facilitate Sweden's purchase of ITMOs under Article 6.2. And what that means in practice is that we're expecting projects to be registered with Gold Standard, to go through the Gold Standard process, and then the credits issued to those projects will be used by Sweden towards their domestic target under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. And we have that with Sweden. We're expecting Gold Standard to be used in the same way by other countries in the future as well. So we expect there to be a use of Gold Standard credits towards NDCs, which needs this kind of process. The second use is for credits which will be used towards CORSIA. So for most standards at the moment, vintage eligibility for CORSIA units runs up to the end of 2020. And the reason for that is that the ICAO Council wants standards to have in place measures by which they can avoid double claiming between CORSIA and host countries' NDCs. And so this process by which we can manage double claiming with NDCs will be needed to unlock post-2020 vintage eligibility for CORSIA. So we're expecting this to be used for credits which are used towards CORSIA. And then the final use, and the one that's had lots of discussion in the market over the past year, is use in the voluntary carbon market. So we expect that there will be demand for carbon credits, which will have a corresponding adjustment in the carbon market for voluntary use, for voluntary offsetting. And I'll talk a bit more about this in the claims section in a second. But these are broadly the 3 different applications which we expect will need to have this process by which we'll manage units authorized under Article 6. And then a question which some of you might have is, why now? Why are we publishing this at this point, prior to Article 6 negotiations taking place in a couple of weeks' time? And the thing I want to say on this is, as has been brought up already by Sarah and by Felipe and by Florian, we very much hope and are fully behind Article 6 negotiators to agree a rulebook for Article 6 at the COP in a few weeks' time. We think that's really critical for Article 6 activity to work in a high integrity way and to have a meaningful impact towards climate action. And by introducing the rules now or starting to consult now, what we want to do is make sure that once we have that Article 6 rulebook, we are ready in Gold Standard to manage units which will apply Article 6. So we want to be as ready as possible to avoid further delays after the several years of delays that we've already had. And so we will, after the end of this consultation period, take into account feedback that we've received from any of you and from other stakeholders, but we'll also take into account any outcome on Article 6 from COP and make sure that our process facilitates that. On to the next slide, please. I'm on the next slide after this going to just explain some of the key steps which are involved in this process that we are putting forward for consultation. But I just wanted to point everyone towards this, which you will find in the document itself, which is a flowchart which tries quite simply to explain what this means in practice and what the different steps are for managing these units, tracking corresponding adjustments and reflecting credits appropriately in our registry. And one of the things that I just wanted to bring out on this slide is there is a pretty equal division of work between different actors in this. There are some tasks which sit with the project developer, but in practice they are actually not too many. And there are other tasks which sit with Gold Standard in terms of making sure that this functionally works on our registry, making sure that we are reporting appropriately on credits which have been used under Article 6. And then there are other tasks which sit with the host countries. And so making this work in practice will involve all three of those different actors and others as well. And so there's a different way of working that which we and others who want to apply Article 6 will really need in the future. So there'll be a stronger role for host countries than we've had in the past in the voluntary market. On to the next slide, please. On the slide here, you'll see the four main steps essentially in this process, which I just wanted to explain in a bit of detail. The first one is a letter of authorization. So Article 6.3 of the Paris Agreement, we're getting technical, specifies that activity which is emission reductions which are transacted under Article 6 need to be authorized by the host country. And so one of the kind of primary things that we will need in order to register and track units as authorized under Article 6 is an official host country letter, which specifies an authorization for emission reductions from a specific project and declares that the host country will account for the reduction caused by that project by applying relevant corresponding adjustments. And in the process that we're consulting on, we've provided a model letter which project developers may use. What we've also done, though, is in the process there are a kind of set of key things that we and others think are needed in a letter to provide that confidence that an authorization has been made in the proper way. And so in practice, we're expecting that letters from host countries will vary a bit, and over time there may be a standardized letter which may be slightly different to that in our template. But what we really want is to make sure that some core elements are met in every letter of authorization by a host country. The second core part is how this looks in gold standards registry. So we're at the moment, in parallel to this consultation, making modifications to our registry, which will mean that public users and anyone will be able to see which credits in our registry have authorizations granted to them, which credits have been correspondingly adjusted for by the host country, and you'll be able to see the public the sort of source documentation as well. So in the documents for each project where these authorizations have been given, we will have the letters of authorization and evidence of a corresponding adjustment. So there will be transparency in gold standards registry for this. We'll also make sure that the use case is tracked for credits which have an authorization. So if a credit is used for CORSIA, we'll make sure that that is tracked to help host countries to report appropriately to the UNFCCC and to help ICAO as well. The third part is reporting. So we expect that we will need to provide an annual report on the issuance of units which have been authorized under Article 6 and on their retirement. And that will be needed by host countries for their reporting to the UNFCCC. It will also be needed by ICAO for CORSIA compliance as well. So that will be a new feature which will come from Gold Standard, this annual report on authorized units and where they are in our registry. And then finally, we have procedures in place and we will need to develop these further to track corresponding adjustments. So making sure that corresponding adjustments have actually been applied by the host country for specific credits that have been retired. And in cases where a corresponding adjustment hasn't been applied, to make sure that any risks of double claiming are addressed and that we reconcile credits where corresponding adjustments haven't been applied. And I'm going to talk a bit about that in a second as well. But these are essentially the four main steps in the process that we are establishing. On to the next slide, please. What I wanted to make clear to everyone on the call in this slide is that what we're putting in place to facilitate Article 6 activity is just one part of what is needed if we're going to see Article 6 scaling up and being moved forward in an efficient way. Other elements which are needed, firstly, a comprehensive workable Article 6 rulebook. In practice, Article 6.2, so the part of Article 6 which allows kind of bilateral authorizations and agreements between parties, can move forward without an Article 6 rulebook. So even if we don't get agreement at COP26 later this year, we would still expect some countries to make authorizations under Article 6, and we'd still expect to be managing some units as gold standard. But in practice, for this to really work, and for there to be confidence from all market actors, it will be really important and valuable that we do have an Article 6 rulebook. So we do hope that negotiators are able to agree that in a few weeks' time. The second element is host country arrangement. So I mentioned earlier that one step in our process is letters of authorization. There is, of course, a lot behind that on the host country side. So host countries will need to have an established entity who has the mandate to provide those authorization letters. They'll need to understand what this means for delivery of their NDC, and they'll need to have processes to work with standards like us and to apply corresponding adjustments properly. And I know that for many countries at the moment, these processes don't exist, but I think if you take more of a medium-term view on this, I think in the most recent set of updated NDCs, over 80% of NDCs state that the country is either planning to or is interested in using Article 6. So there is a lot of interest out there in setting up these kind of established arrangements and in using Article 6 and benefiting from investment in activities, even if those processes aren't quite there yet in many countries. And then the final step is, outside of host countries and outside of Article 6 rules, market innovation. So there is a lot of space still, I think, to tackle some of the issues which may be barriers or may make the whole system more clunky if they aren't addressed. And I just want to pick up on two things which I think will be important for other actors in the market to try to address over the next few years. The first of those is about communication between different registries. So I mentioned earlier that we expect to, and we plan to produce an annual report on the issuance of credits and the retirement of credits which have been authorized under Article 6. I hope that in the future we move away from a system where there's an annual report from Gold Standard which is used by host countries, and instead we see more real-time interconnection between our registry and that of host countries, and that we see a kind of closer link between what happens in our registry and the information which host countries have, and then vice versa as well. And there are some really interesting solutions which are coming forward for this. So some of the work that the Climate Warehouse is doing, which some of you might be aware about, the World Bank's Climate Warehouse, I think is really important on this type of question. And then the second one is, and I think this will be an issue which we'll see across the market, it's not exclusively for Gold Standard, is the question of what happens if a host country doesn't apply a corresponding adjustment that it has given an authorization for. And I think that there's a lot more work that can be done to see how that risk can be appropriately managed so this doesn't become a barrier to Article 6 scaling. And there's some work which has already been done on this by Pollination earlier this year. So there was a report which they did looking at these kinds of risks. And again, there's some work that the World Bank has done looking at how political risk around corresponding adjustments can be managed through insurance. And this is an area where I think there are kind of clear solutions which can come through and can help with that risk. And we want, as Gold Standard, to see what we can do to support that work. But I think that there's more work which can be done in that area in particular. So I hope that that happens in the coming years as this moves forward. Moving on to the next slide, please. I think for some of you, what I've just said will make total sense, and this is something which you'll have been thinking about and planning for. For others, that may not be the case. And we in Gold Standard are very conscious that Article 6 is a new way of working for project developers, for host countries, for standards like us and like other standards as well. And we don't just want to produce these requirements and then hope that they're used appropriately. We want to make sure that there is support available for stakeholders, whether that's project developers, host countries or others, who intend to make use of this and who intend to take forward the first activities under Article 6 to make sure that this can be done in a robust way and in a way that is accessible for all project developers, not just those who have more resource and more expertise here. So alongside the consultation, which we launched last week, we also launched an expression of interest for a new programme that we're going to be launching next year to help early movers on Article 6. The structure of this is still being developed at the moment, but there's really three core objectives that we want to have through this. The first is to make sure that those who are moving first over the course of next year to receive or to provide authorizations under Article 6 receive the support that they need to understand and to appropriately apply our requirements. So there will be support available from Gold Standard for those who wish to use this early. The second is to make sure that for those who are moving early, we kind of take advantage of the lessons and the models that are developed through their work, and we use them to enable a wider adoption and scaling of Article 6. So Florian talked earlier about Atmosphere's advanced work already to receive authorizations from 2 countries. And we really want to make sure that the lessons which are learned from early movers are kind of shared widely, so we can scale Article 6 well, because I think that's in all of our interests, those who are interested in the market. And then the third objective is we're putting forward for consultation at the moment a process by which we will manage units authorized under Article 6. But I don't think that that process is perfect yet. And I think that there are ways in which we can learn from experience to make it more efficient and to make it more usable for project developers, for host countries, to understand how to fill in some of the grey areas that need to be filled in between the different elements of our requirements. And so we really want to learn from experience next year to make sure that we have requirements in place that are fit for purpose. And this is one thing that I want to say here as well. I think some of you will have read through what we've published last week. Some of you may not have done so yet. And I just want to say that our objective is to make it as easy and efficient as possible for project developers and host countries to take forward action under Article 6. It's not in our interest at all to make this harder than it needs to be. So there are some elements where we think that there is probably more work that we can do to make things more efficient. And we hope that as we all learn over time, we'll be able to bring those in. So that's our objective here. Just going back to the Early Movers Programme, this is available for anyone who has an interest in applying the rules that we're putting forward. So that could be project developers, host governments and other actors. And we have on our website, and we shared in a newsletter last week, a place where you can express interest. And there's no obligation involved in doing that. But what it does is it just makes us aware of the fact that you, depending on whoever actor you are interested in this. And it means that we can provide more information about what's available in the near future. Going on to the next slide. The other thing that we published last week is a revised version of our claims guidelines. So Gold Standard has in the past had claims guidelines in place, and the purpose of this is to set out what are appropriate claims that can be made for many different elements of using Gold Standard. So for project developers at different stages in the design certification place, what claims you can make at different points. And then also for the use of Gold Standard products. So if you are using a Gold Standard carbon credit, a PER, or any other form of product that we issue, the types of claims that are appropriate to make when using those. And there has been, again, a lot of discussion over the past year and before about this question of claims and integrity on the demand side. And I think many of you will have seen the consultation that Gold Standard launched earlier this year, which was which featured this issue of different claims that can be made with respect to carbon credits. And there are really 3 key messages and things which have changed in this version of the claims guidelines versus past ones, which are related to the use of carbon credits. The first thing that we say in this new version of our claims guidelines is all credits can be used towards claims that describe the climate mitigation and other SDG impacts represented by carbon credits. So any of the credits that we issue if you want to use those credits and retire them as a corporate towards your kind of climate action goals, you can of course make a claim about the impact which that has achieved on the ground. The second element relates to compensatory claims. So this includes offsetting claims, carbon neutrality claims, claims that imply that emissions by the buyer have been compensated. And in this case, what we say is that we as Gold Standard believe that the claims that are appropriate, the credits that are appropriate to use towards those claims are those from before the Paris period, which follow other parts of Gold Standard's double counting rules. And for post-2020 credits, those which are authorized for use under Article 6, so those that have followed the process that I've just explained. And that's Gold Standard's guidance on the appropriate use of credits towards compensatory claims. And that, I think, shouldn't come as a surprise to those who've been following what Gold Standard has been saying over the past year. I think that's come through in lots of our messaging. And then the third part of what we say is clearly we're in a place now where there is uncertainty around claims that can be made appropriately in this period. There are some who've been following this very closely. There are some companies who have not been following this very closely. And also we're in a place now where credits aren't available, which have corresponding adjustments. That will come through, we think, over the next few years for sure, but that's not the case at the moment. And so it's understandable that there will be a transitional period as the market adjusts to this new context under the Paris Agreement. But what we say is that we're encouraging users to align with our guidance as soon as is practicable. I'll stop there for this slide here and I'll move on to the next slide. I just wanted to, I want to finish in the next 3 minutes to make sure there's enough time for questions, but I just wanted to set out, there's a lot of text on this slide, but there's a lot of uncertainty around some of these issues around Article 6 and corresponding adjustments and claims. So I just wanted to set out on this slide, which I think will be shared afterwards, quite clearly what all of this means in practice. The first thing that it means is that project developers that use Gold Standard will have a route to develop activities authorized under Article 6. So you will have a route through Gold Standard to generate credits which are eligible for use under CORSIA for post-2020 credits, for use towards NDCs in the future, and for use towards credible offsetting claims in the voluntary carbon market. This won't be required that all project developers follow this, but it will be an option which is available to everyone. The second part is we will provide technical support to make this work. We're really committed in Gold Standard to making sure that Article 6 can work and working with different standards and with different actors to make sure that this can get off the ground. The third part is we're not trying to set up our own process here, which is distinct from everything else. We will align our process and requirements with any relevant outcome from UNEDRC negotiations. The role that we're playing is facilitating rather than setting up our own rules. The fourth point is that we, through our claims guidelines, want to provide guidance to support responsible claims by users. There's been a lot of talk about requirements for corresponding adjustments in the voluntary carbon market. And the approach that we are taking is one of guidance and guidelines. So you will see very clearly in our guidelines what we think, what credits we think are appropriate for different uses. But we won't, for instance, have restrictions on our registry which mandate and enforce that, and we won't police. The fourth part is, as I just said, a transitional period is understandable as there is an adjustment to this, and as credits become available for use under Article 6. But the other thing I want to say is the issue of claims isn't something which is Gold Standards on our own. There are other actors, governments, civil society who are very conscious of this issue and want to see responsible claims. And there is a voluntary carbon markets integrity initiative which is going on at the moment, which is looking to provide guidance across the market. And so I don't think a transitional period is something that can be used as an excuse to put off addressing what is an important issue for market integrity. So the longer the transition, the greater the risk of deferring or displacing action. So when we say in our guidelines that we encourage users to align as soon as is practicable, I hope that we do see movement on claims in the very near future to make sure that claims made for credits in the voluntary market are made with integrity. And then the final thing I wanted to say is a lot of focus in use of the carbon market is on compensatory claims, so carbon offsetting, carbon neutrality. Impact-based claims, so claims which are more focused on the impact which has been achieved through finance, can be made credibly now for all carbon credits. It's a different type of claim, and it's one which can sit alongside credits being used towards a host country's NDC. So we in Gold Standard are really committed to supporting greater understanding around impact-based claims, and we hope that other actors take this forward as well. Just finally on the next slide, I just want to provide a little overview here of our next steps, so what comes next. So of course we have COP26 taking place in a couple of weeks' time, and our consultation will close shortly after that on the 19th of November. And I'm just focusing here for a second on the black text. After the end of our consultation and post COP26, we plan to then make any amendments which are needed to these documents, and we will look very carefully at feedback which we receive from stakeholders, and then to introduce final versions around the end of this year, and around the same time to introduce new functionality in the registry to make this possible. And then from the beginning of next year, as I mentioned earlier, we plan to start to support stakeholders who are using these requirements in this procedure to make sure that this works in practice. Looking at the things in yellow, it's not in our gift to say that post 2020 gold standard credits can be used towards CORSIA, but we hope that by putting these procedures in place, we will get that approval from ICAO in the near future, and that will be brought forward over the course of next year. And then we'll also look very closely at, and are sort of working constructively as part of the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, looking at claims guidelines across the market, and we expect that to come forward next year as well. And then a final quick note, this is one part of our work to support work under Article 6. Some of you may have seen that we established we're establishing a working group which is helping us with some other parts of Article 6 alignment, and we expect that to get started soon, and some other parts of alignment with Article 6 coming forward over the course of next year. And I've spoken for longer than I hoped to, so I'll stop there and pass back to Sarah to moderate.
Thanks, Hugh. We do fortunately have some questions coming in from the stands. Let's start with a broader one. If our methodology or something close to it will be agreed upon, will gold standard authorized credits be recognized by all countries internationally? And I'll ask you to field that one, Hugh.
Yes. Sorry, I was just trying to find the question. So how we expect this to work in practice is that, I mean, if you look at this, the example which I mentioned earlier for Sweden, Sweden, in effect, what they will be doing is specifying that gold standard credits are eligible for use towards their NDC. And so they will be making that decision, and gold standard credits can therefore be used for that purpose. And we expect other countries to do the same as well. So I don't think it will be the case that we'll see an automatic recognition by all countries. That's not the way that this will work in practice. What we will instead see, I think, is countries deciding to deem eligible credits under gold standard or under other standards as well. And you've kind of seen something similar outside of Article 6 in South Africa, for instance, where the South African government has deemed eligible for its carbon tax credits from VCS and from gold standard. And I think a similar principle will apply here, where countries will make a choice as to which standards they see as eligible. The other thing which I just wanted to say quickly on this as well is the process that we are putting forward here isn't something that we've completely invented on our own. We, a few years ago, were involved in a cross-standard process, which was really looking at how all standards can manage double counting with NDCs, and that was specifically for CORSIA. And there was a process a few years ago which came up with a core set of principles. And one of the purposes of that was to really make sure that as standards introduce processes like this, there is some consistency across what they're doing. And so that's something which we think is really important for the market, that we don't have a case where each standard has a different set of requirements, but there is a lot of commonality between what different standards apply, because that makes it easier for host countries, for project developers, and for everyone.
Great, thanks. We have 2 questions from Paul Chiplin, which I'll package together and ask you to respond to, Hugh. He points out that in a previous consultation that we specified that corresponding adjustments would not be required for projects and LDCs until 2025. Is that still the case, or has our stance changed? And then secondly, is there any guidance from Gold Standard as what would happen if the host country refuses to provide an LOA?
Yeah, so on that second question, it's not in, I mean, the right lies with the host country to decide whether or not they wish to authorize credits for use under Article 6, so whether or not they wish to say that they will make a corresponding adjustment. And that's very clear in the Paris Agreement. The use of Article 6 is voluntary and it's up for host countries. So there is nothing that Gold Standard can do if a host country decides not to provide an LOA. What we do through this process is, if there is an LOA, so if there is a letter of authorization, we have a process by which we manage that, and we make sure that credits are marked in our registry in the right way. We share information back with the host country. We receive information from them on the application of corresponding adjustment. So that's for the first question. On the second one, I mean, what Paul describes there was something that we consulted on, and I think there were 2 things that came through in that consultation, which I think were kind of led to the approach that we plan to take. We're taking kind of, or we're proposing in this consultation here. The first is that is this question of requirement or not? And I think what I sort of mentioned earlier is Gold Standard's providing guidance on what we think is appropriate. And if we really look at that, the issue of double claiming or the issue of potential risk of deferral of action exists from now because we're already in the NDC implementation period. And so that's really why we have come to the approach that we have, where we're providing guidance. We're not introducing a requirement, but our guidance is clear that this is a potential risk that exists from this point rather than from some point in the future, because we are now in the period of NDCs being implemented. And the second thing that came through, and which was something that we definitely took into account, but others may have different views on, is one of the virtues of Article 6 is that it doesn't differentiate between different types of countries. And that was something that we took note of in some of the feedback that we received, that Article 6 applies to all countries. Any country can be a buyer, any country can be a seller. And so differentiating is something that some people weren't so comfortable with because it went against the principle of what is there in Article 6. So those are some of the things that we took into account in that consultation, and which took us to the approach which we're proposing here.
Great, thanks. We are also joined by our CTO, Owen Hewlett. So there's an early question that I'm going to direct towards Owen, which is, how is Gold Standard distinguishing the differences between removal, avoidance, and reduction carbon credits, as these, as he claims, cannot be used interchangeably? Owen, would you like to take that one?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Sarah. And so I think what that question is driving at is that apart from what a credit can be used for, you can also distinguish between credits based on the type of mitigation outcome that they represent, if you like. So an emission reduction being a change from, say, one technology type to an improved technology type, and the difference between an avoided emission being remaining, the baseline scenario is maintained, typically seen in things like avoided deforestation, which we don't certify, and then carbon removals being the flux between atmosphere and storage process and pool, so sequestration of greenhouse gas emissions effectively. And so yes, indeed, we already do actually differentiate between those units at the methodological level. So it's very easy to tell which projects are removals and which ones are reductions. Our registry will also make that more explicit. I think whether they can be used interchangeably depends on the application. So I think for general voluntary offsetting, they can be used interchangeably. For something like the net zero definition of science-based targets, they've made it very clear that only removals, based on other preconditions, can be used. So for sure, that's another kind of layer of differentiation in the registry that needs to happen, and it will affect which unit types can be used for which purpose. But I think I'm right here in saying CORSIA doesn't make a differentiation between reductions and removals, right? So the interchangeability or not depends on application, but we will certainly make it clear what's eligible for what purpose.
Great, thank you. Hugh, another one for you, a great question asking, could you please elaborate the difference relationship between the voluntary market, as you explained, and the bi-country cooperation, for example, CLIC in Switzerland, the JCM in Japan, and/or Sweden?
Yeah, I can, of course, yeah. I mean, there are different ways in which countries will use Article 6.2. So Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement is essentially accounting rules, and countries can apply those accounting rules in different ways. The way that Japan has gone so far for its JCM is they do things very much in a bilateral way, where there is a system which is set up, which is run between Japan and its the countries with which it works, and they don't work with a standard like gold standard or like Vera. The way that the model which we're working on with Sweden would work is that they would work with a standard, they would work with us, and there are other countries in the future who may be using Article 6.2 who may do the same. So rather than reinventing everything and setting up their own system, they'll work with one or more standards. So they may work with gold standard, they may work with gold standard and Vera, they may work with a suite of different standards. And where that's the case, there isn't any real difference between credits which, gold standard credits, which would be used in the voluntary market or would be used for compliance by Sweden. So we would, projects for both uses would follow our rules and requirements in the same way. Projects for both uses would follow this new process that we've set up. And if the host country has authorized, has given a kind of more blanket authorization under Article 6, in theory, credits given to a project could be used partly for Sweden, could be used partly in the voluntary market, could be used partly for CORSIA. And when Sarah at the start talked about a kind of supporting growth of a global market, that's kind of what we're pointing to here. Article 6, in a way, kind of allows us to kind of treat units in the same way and to kind of set up a system which works for different purposes.
Great. There's a question that either of you might want to touch on. The question is, how do you ensure that a user of credits makes the correct claim? As we've mentioned, we won't police claims. So maybe this is an opportunity to talk about how we see a way to grow demand for these impact claims that you've mentioned and outlined, Hugh, and some of the collaborations that might bring this forward.
Yeah. I mean, one of the first things to say on this is when a credit has been authorized under Article 6, we will make sure that the claim is specified because that's needed for Article 6 reporting. So if there's a credit which has been authorized under Article 6, the host country will make a corresponding adjustment for it. We will need to know, is that credit being used towards an NDC? Is it being used towards CORSIA? Is it being used in the voluntary market? Because that's all information which the host country will need to know. But in terms of corporate users who are then kind of away from our system making different types of claims, whether that's carbon neutrality, carbon negative, anything like that, there's kind of a broader role and responsibility beyond gold standard to be looking at that type of claim. And this is something that I mentioned it earlier, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative is really looking at. And so outside of gold standard, I know that one of the things that the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative is looking at is some kind of better way of tracking claims which are being made and making sure that they're being made in a responsible way. So not just providing guidance on what claims should be made, but providing more transparency. And I don't know if it will come to policing, but providing more of a system for that. So I think that's my sort of thing on this is gold standard very much has an interest in ensuring responsible claims, but there's a broader landscape beyond us, which also includes governments. We're seeing some governments cracking down on irresponsible claims as well. So there is a role beyond just gold standard here.
Great, That's super. Maybe we just have 1 minute, so I'll ask you, Hugh, to stay with you. Ralph Westerman asked, bilateral negotiations about corresponding adjustments approvals between authorized national authorities and project developers can be successful, but will mostly be difficult and inefficient. How can these negotiations be handled in a better and efficient manner? In 30 seconds or less.
30 seconds. I mean, this is a key example of what I said earlier about the fact that all of us are starting from a base where we're getting started right now, and we'll move to a place where this is more efficient and is more scalable. And on this question, I think the best practice examples on the host country side will be host countries which have established transparent processes that can be used by all project developers, identify priority sectors into which they would like investment, and basically have efficient processes, give direction to project developers, and this becomes clearer as to how this will work in practice, and we get rid of some of the inefficiencies that we may see at first. And I think that countries which put in place that kind of procedures will be rewarded by more interest from project developers in investing in their countries. So I think that we will see best practice examples coming through in the near future.
So hopefully not just the burden or the onus on the project developer, but that also the host countries can come forward. Super. Well, that brings us to time. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all of our panelists and to all of you who have joined us. We do welcome your comment through the 19th of November and are available for further follow-up one-on-one as needed. We really appreciate your attention and your questions and your feedback throughout the consultation process. So thanks very much, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future.